Hello, welcome to Cardio Flash College, a place to learn cardiology with flash animations. Today we have the collaboration of Dr. David Dobarro, clinical cardiologist, member of the heart failure unit of the Hospital Álvaro Cunqueiro at Vigo, and together we will review everything you need to know about the hydrodynamic behavior of long-term ventricular assistance. Join us! As you know, heart transplantation is the last therapeutic option in patients with advanced heart failure refractory to optimal medical treatment. However, this tool is becoming less and less accessible, since not only are the number of heart patients increasing worldwide, but the number of donors available each year is progressively less. For these reasons, a lot of time and effort has been invested in the development of alternative therapies for the treatment of this entity, such as, for example, the left ventricular assist devices, also known as LVAD. In the beginning, LVADs were used as a measure of temporary ventricular support in patients with end-stage heart disease who were awaiting a heart transplantation. But over the years, these devices have evolved in such a way that today they constitute a valid therapeutic alternative in those patients in whom transplantation is no longer possible. In this way, different studies have shown that patients with advanced heart failure treated with LVADs achieve a higher survival rate compared to patients treated conservatively. For these reasons, LVADs are commonly used in three clinical settings. These are bridge to transplantation, bridge to candidacy, and destination therapy. LVADs, as a bridge to transplantation, are used in those patients who, having previously been accepted for heart transplantation, have such a delicate clinical situation that they would probably die before receiving the organ, because, in some cases, the chances of receiving a suitable heart can be so small that the waiting time is excessively long. We are talking, for example, of allosensitized patients with unfavorable blood groups or with a large body surface area. For their part, LVADs as a bridge to candidacy are implanted in patients with temporary contraindications for heart transplantation, conditions that are usually the consequence of low cardiac output and chronic systemic congestion. In this way, LVADs can stabilize the clinical situation of the patient and thus facilitate their re-inclusion in the waiting lists for heart transplantation, and even, in some cases, the partial or total recovery of ventricular function. Finally, with regard to destination therapies, we can say that although LVADs are not approved for this purpose in all European countries, they are frequently used as destination therapy in daily clinical practice, because, as you know, many of the patients who receive LVAD as a bridge to transplantation die before receiving the organ, since the lack of transplantable hearts is increasing. However, it must be made clear that LVADs cannot currently be used to replace heart transplantation, since current models still have many technological limitations and a not inconsiderable rate of complications during follow-up. But are all LVADs the same, or are there differences between them? Let's take a look. As you know, LVADs can be of pulsatile flow or of continuous flow. And although from a physiological point of view, it might be logical to think that pulsatile flow LVADs would have to be better than continuous flow LVADs, in clinical practice the opposite has been seen, as different studies have shown that the survival rate of patients treated with continuous flow LVAD is significantly higher than that of patients treated with pulsatile flow LVAD. But why have these results been obtained? Very simple. Because pulsatile flow devices are technologically more complex and vulnerable to mechanical wear, which clinically translates into a higher rate of device replacement and, in parallel, in an increase of mortality and cardiovascular complications. However, despite the fact that continuous flow LVADs are simpler and safer, they are not without complications, since, for example, their use in children is associated with distal vascular underdevelopment and a lower probability of recovery of ventricular function compared to pulsatile flow devices. In any case, continuous flow LVADs are the most used today. So, we have to know that continuous flow LVADs are made up of an inlet port, an outlet port, and a single rotating element between them, all covered by a rigid casing that incorporates the engines, magnets, electromagnets, and/or mechanical bearings that move and hold the rotor. Well, let's dip in a little into these bearing systems. Thus, we have the mechanical bearings, which are made up of ceramic elements that fix the rotor to the device's casing. Next, we have hydrodynamic bearings, where the impeller levitates by the action of a thin film of blood that separates the rotor from the housing. On the other hand, there are the electromagnetic bearings, where the impeller levitates through the action of electromagnets. And finally, we have the bearing systems based on permanent magnetism, where the rotor is suspended due to the rejection that is generated between the opposing magnets of the impeller and the casing. The main difference between the previously discussed bearing systems is their complexity and reliability. The mechanical bearings, compared to the levitating bearings of the rest of the systems, have rigid elements that fix the rotor, and therefore are more vulnerable to friction, which translates into a greater probability of wear, hemolysis, and thrombosis of the system. On the other hand, levitating bearings do not suffer mechanical fatigue and present a lower risk of thrombosis or hemolysis. However, these devices are so complex that the impeller can lose stability due to minor system failures or changes in magnetic forces. Finally, mixed systems have the advantage of always presenting a hydrodynamic backup system in case of failure of the magnetic system, although they are more prone to hemolysis than pure magnetic levitation systems. Complex, right? Well, let's talk now about the rotor and how it influences the hydrodynamic behavior of the device. As you know, we find two types of continuous flow devices, those with centrifugal flow and those with axial flow. Centrifugal continuous flow LVADs are made up of a rotating disc with obliquely arranged metal plates, which move the blood tangentially through it and generate a perpendicular flow with respect to itself, while farther apart, continuous axial flow LVADs work by means of a helical rotor that is arranged along the system, being capable of generating a longitudinal flow that begins at the inlet port and ends at the outlet port. And how does this influence the hydrodynamic behavior of the device? Well, in many ways, so we better go in parts. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with delta P. What is delta P? Delta P is nothing more than the pressure difference between the inlet port and the outlet port of a hydrodynamic pump. In our case, it indicates the pressure difference between the left ventricular cavity and the aorta. Thus, we have to know that delta P varies throughout the cardiac cycle, because as you can suppose, delta P decreases during ventricular systole because at that moment the pressures between the aorta and the left ventricle are equalized. On the other hand, in diastole the opposite occurs, since the pressure of the left ventricle is lower than the aortic pressure, and for this reason a pressure gradient is created between both cavities, which translates into an increase in the value of delta P. In this way, the fluctuations that occur in this pressure gradient, or delta P, condition physiological phenomena, such as the opening or closing of the aortic valve, and, in the same way, they condition the flow of blood through the LVAD. In this order of ideas, we can assume that delta P is a pressure gradient against which the LVADs have to act. So, the lower the value of delta P, the greater the flow of the device, and vice versa. Well, the next thing we need to know is that delta P does not affect all LVADs in the same way. In this sense, centrifugal flow systems have a flattened operating curve. This means that small changes in delta P translate into large flow changes through the pump. This explains why centrifugal continuous flow LVADs act with certain pulsatility, as they present significant flow oscillations in response to pressure changes throughout the cardiac cycle, presenting peak flows in systole and valley flows in diastole. For their part, continuous axial flow LVADs have a linear relationship between flow and delta P. For this reason, and unlike centrifugal systems, there is hardly any pulsatility throughout the cardiac cycle, so they are less vulnerable to changes in delta P. Well, having understood this, it will be easier for us to move on to the next point, the pulsatility of flow. The flow pulsatility, also known as the pulsatility index, is a parameter used to measure the oscillations that the pump flow undergoes throughout the cardiac cycle. Thus, flow pulsatility is directly proportional to myocardial contractility and inversely proportional to the degree of emptiness that exists in the left ventricle. For these reasons, this parameter can be used as an indirect indicator of ventricular function during support. In this way, we can understand that flow pulsatility is low in patients with poor ventricular contractility. It is also low in patients with limited aortic valve opening, and of course it is also low in patients with empty left ventricles or with low flow, either due to dehydration or right ventricular failure. While, for its part, pulsatility increases with the administration of inotropic drugs, with the recovery of ventricular function, or with activities that increase right cardiac output, such as sport practices. Let us now move on to another important hemodynamic parameter, preload. As you know, we use the term preload to refer to the volume of blood that stretches the myocardial fibers before ventricular systole occurs. And as you can imagine, this hemodynamic parameter has a significant influence on cardiac output. However, its effect is less relevant on LVADs, since these pumps are less dependent on preload than the human heart. And what about postload? Well, quite the opposite, since LVADs are much more sensitive to postload than the human heart. And the truth is that this does not have to surprise us, since we have already seen that delta P and postload are practically the same thing, and that when delta P increases, the flow of the LVAD decreases. Thus, it is necessary to control systemic vascular resistance in order to guarantee adequate cardiac output. In consequence, the mean arterial pressure must be below 90 millimeters of mercury, otherwise the LVAD will not be able to achieve an appropriate flow. This, as you will remember, is especially important in centrifugal flow pumps, as they are very vulnerable to changes in delta P, since their operating curve is flatter, which means that small changes in pressure can translate into large changes in flow. However, axial flow pumps have a linear flow pressure curve, and for this reason, they can retain a certain ability to operate in the face of high vascular resistances, even at the expense of increasing suction at the inlet port. Which brings us to our last section, hemolysis. Because yes, suction at the entry port can cause hemolysis, although this is not the only cause. You see, hemolysis is related to the rotation speed of the rotor, the existence of areas of great shear stress within the system, and the time that blood spends within them. Thus, LVADs with axial rotors or mechanical bearings generate more shear stress than LVADs with centrifugal rotors or levitating bearings, respectively. However, the truth is that hemolysis is a rare problem with current LVADs. Finally, we can say that long-term ventricular assist devices are here to stay, and although they still have much to improve, the truth is that they already constitute a very useful therapeutic tool in patients with advanced heart failure refractory to optimal medical treatment. After this brief review, it is clear to us that continuous flow devices are the best option, and although the hydrodynamic behavior of axial or centrifugal rotors is different, both systems seem equally efficient and safe. In this way, we say goodbye. It has been all for today at Cardio Flash College. We hope you liked the video. If so, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. We'll see you in the next class. And remember, don't come late. Bye!